Great stuff. So Larry, welcome to your first Tuesday night book club. Your first one obviously being the one where you present at, which is always adding a little bit more pressure to you. No better man. I know Larry from, I guess, just from doing the podcast, and we talked a couple of times. We did a couple of interviews with each other over the last few years, so I know he's somebody that's very passionate about the topics he prolifically writes on, and fits well in with the theme of this. So delighted to have you here, Larry. Thanks for doing it, and I'll hand it over to yourself.
Likewise. Yeah, thanks a million. Thanks for the invite. So, I mean, whatever way you want to approach it, I mean, the book I picked is one that I suppose has certain meaning for me insofar as it kind of gave validation to certain ways I operate and what have you. So it's Creativity by, I'm going to pronounce the book or the author's name, or do my best to pronounce his name. It's probably wrong, but Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi is the author. He's a psychologist and has written and researched extensively on creativity in various domains. And it's, you know what, I was flicking through it over the last few days, just refreshing my memory on it, and there's just so much material in here. You know, you couldn't talk about every chapter. I picked maybe chapter 3 and 4 as something we could concentrate on a little bit tonight, you know.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
So really, I suppose what I took from it over the years of being in work, and I started in business for myself when I was about 25. And, you know, when you start out first in any kind of field, you tend to, you know, question your motivations and question whether you're getting the best out of people that are with you, your own employees and maybe contractors that work for you or whatever. It doesn't matter what field you're in. Well, I certainly did. And I suppose my best and worst attribute in a working environment is that I'm quite picky about the standard of work that I do, and for years that always brought a degree of conflict for myself in dealing with people and what have you. And one of the first things that Csikszentmihalyi said in his book that I read was that he was talking about the creative personality, and there's a passage there I highlighted in the book. I could read a little bit of it for you. So he says that attention is limited and that we have to be selective about where we put our attention in order to get the best out of our work and what we do. And he said a consequence of limited attention is that creative individuals are often considered odd or even arrogant, selfish and ruthless. It is important to keep in mind that these are not traits of creative people, but traits that the rest of us attribute to them on the basis of our perceptions. So he goes on to talk about how that consequence of limited attention can be seen by other people as, you know, you're not giving me enough of your time, or you're maybe arrogant or selfish, or in something other than how we would want other people to be, or maybe you're insensitive in some way. So it was interesting to read that off the bat. He says that creative people are neither single-minded, specialised, nor selfish. Indeed, they seem to be the opposite. They love to make connections with adjacent areas of knowledge. They tend to be, in principle, caring and sensitive, yet the demands of their role inevitably push them towards specialisation and selfishness. So in other words, you know, when you're immersed in something, you're immersed in a piece of work that you don't have time necessarily for distractions. And he points that out as a particular aspect of creative people, that they're able to immerse themselves in their work and exclude all of these other things and other people, often to the detriment of relationships, you know. So that was something that stood out for me. He goes on in chapter 3 to talk about, I think it's chapter 3. Yeah, it goes on to talk extensively about the nature of the creative personality, and suggests that it's not fixed, that it varies depending on the environment. So I suppose I found a certain aspect of myself in the book, which is why I kind of validated my approach to work. Because I think invariably, certainly, if you're running a business, you've got to be particular about the standard of work that you do, especially if you're looking for clients to come back, and you want your employees and the people that work for you and represent you to meet that standard. And often it's very difficult because you're bringing in people with all these different learnings from different areas of their life, and they're not going to have the same attention to detail. And that was always a challenge for me in work. I don't know about you guys, but it always brought conflict with within the work environment. And being in the construction industry, it's kind of an adversarial field at the best of times. It didn't help, But have you read it yourself, Rob?
No, I don't think I've read it. I think I've read Flow, and I don't know which came first. Probably was Flow before that one, or
Flow, yeah.
And I absolutely can, I think there was a moment maybe 20, 15 years ago or so when I would have kind of recognized similar traits, but kind of realized that not everybody can be at the same level as you are within certain competencies or whatever. So it's kind of, you accept that and kind of look at it from a different lens. I suppose that's been the kind of key point that would trigger for me when you talk about that.
Yeah, I suppose it's I mean, if you want to talk about leadership, I know that's your area. You've got to be able to bring the best out in people. And often I think, certainly for a small, I know we're talking about business here, but for small businesses, the challenge is trying to get the best out of a small team while maintaining those high standards. And some research I read in recent times about the self-employed and directly employed people in management positions who have responsibility for other people. In a large corporate environment, they have the support structures within the corporation whereby they can execute their role, but a self-employed person with a small business doesn't have that. And certainly creative people entering self-employment, they have to learn on their feet how to manage all these different personalities, and the structures aren't there for them to rely on and to kind of say, right, well, this is how we do things. So it can be a challenge for them creatively as well as, in the day-to-day running of a business. And I certainly found that. But he goes on, Csikszentmihalyi goes on to devote a chapter, and I suppose on the creative personality, but it leaks into other chapters as well. And he continues to refer back to it. But one aspect of the creative personality, he says, is that the creative person is able to move between the two extremes. It's almost like a dialectic. They're able to, he says here, he talks a bit about the traits. He said, and then there are no traits that distinguish. Are there no traits that distinguish creative people? If I had to express in one word what makes their personalities different from others, it would be complexity. By this, I mean that they show tendencies of thought and action that in most people are segregated. They contain contradictory extremes. Instead of being an individual, each of them is a multitude. Now, I know this is a book and it's designed for, a kind of a broader audience, and you have to generalize and stuff like that. But when you start talking about these things, you could see elements of yourself in what he's talking about. Creativity, I suppose, for me it's not a fixed thing. I don't believe it's like a subject. It's not like making a chair. You can't teach someone to be creative, but you can certainly create the environment or allow the environment where creativity can happen. And he goes on to talk about Divergent and divergent thinking, as opposed to where is the chapter now? Anyway, I can't find it. But modes of thinking and ability to problem solve, for example, problem solving in an environment where there's fixed mindset, for example, is very difficult. As opposed to, divergent people who are able to move between different domains of knowledge and put them all together and come up with solutions. So he goes on to talk about that a little bit too. It highlighted some pages here. He asks, where does creativity live? But chapter 3. Yeah. So he goes on to say that a complex personality does not imply neutrality or the average. So he talks about these extremes and the ability of creative people to move between the extremes and select the type of approach to the problem. So it's not like a blend of good and bad. He says that having a complex personality means being able to express the full range of traits that are potentially present in the human repertoire, but usually atrophy because we think that one or the other pole is good. So I think there's a narrative out there that suggests, let's say in business, that there's a particular personality that's good for business, or maybe a particular personality that's good for leadership roles or whatever. But he warns against that a little bit, because if we approach our work with this idea that there's a particular personality that's good for the work, well, then it doesn't allow us flexibility to move and make the right choices at the right time. He refers to Carl Jung and his idea of the mature personality, which he points out is a combination of both the dark and the light sides of personality. So we're in fact both, and to think that we should be all of one and not accept those aspects of ourselves that others might consider bad is denying ourselves, doesn't allow us be creative, he suggests. So and then he goes on to talk about several aspects, 3, 4 he goes on to talk about 5 or 6 different dualistic or dialectical aspects of personality. He says creative individuals have a great deal of physical energy, but they are also often quiet and at rest. So you could be full of energy, he says, for a particular activity, but then you're also able to, you could be extroverted in your approach to the work and your energy for the work, but also you need to kind of retreat. The creative person needs to retreat within themselves once they finish the work. He says that creative individuals tend to be smart, yet also naive. So suppose that leads into the idea of being serious and playful at the same time, or being able to approach a problem from both angles. I think to be too serious restricts our ability to find solutions, So he goes on to talk about IQ and how IQ is not related to creativity at all, and that there's a particular level of IQ where it doesn't matter anymore. People who are considered having low IQ are probably some of the most creative people out there. So here's the passage actually about convergent and divergent thinking that I was talking about. He says, convergent thinking is measured by IQ tests and involves solving well-defined rational problems that have one correct answer. Divergent thinking, on the other hand, leads to no agreed upon solution. It involves fluency, or the ability to generate a great quantity of ideas, flexibility, or the ability to switch from one perspective to another, and originality in picking up unusual associations. So I think that kind of lets us off the hook a little bit in terms of, this pressure to perform all the time, and the idea that, downtime or just going for a walk or loafing about is valuable, unless you have those periods of time to do nothing or move away from the intensity of the work. But you don't find those solutions. And I was reading, I have a book on the shelf there from Carlo Rovelli, the Italian quantum physicist, gravitational physicist, and he was talking about the years he spent loafing around after he finished college. I think it took him about 5 or 7 years to finish his undergraduate degree. And he latched onto the idea that this period of time where you're actually not engaged in the intensity of the work is vitally important, and allowed, I suppose, him, and he talks about Einstein as well and his ability to pull together all these different ideas about relativity and the concept of time, and his theory of relativity or whatever. So that time away from the work, he says, is very important. He talks about another paradoxical trait, and I touched on it earlier, the seriousness and playfulness. He said, a third paradoxical trait refers to the related combination of playfulness and discipline, or responsibility and irresponsibility. We've got this idea that we've got to be, organized and disciplined, but you look at, famous artists like, I don't know, the Irish artist, what was his first name? Bacon. I can't think of his first name.
Francis Bacon, no?
Francis Bacon. If you've ever seen photographs of his studio, like it's a complete mess. But he managed to create these wonderful works of art, and I think it's important to understand that, certainly with kids, for example, that just because they're disorganized from our perspective, it doesn't mean that they're unable to drill down and focus and create something special, And I see it, like anyone with kids here tonight, you see it all the time in your kids. We're shouting at them all the time to keep their rooms tidy and put their gear away and all that kind of stuff. But yet they're able to switch it on and do something that, we're kind of bowled over as a result. But he talks about, Csikszentmihalyi talks about, goes on to talk further about playfulness. He says, but this playfulness doesn't go very far without its antithesis, a quality of doggedness, endurance, and perseverance. So, anyone who's ever achieved anything in their life will recognize that you've got to be focused and have some endurance, resilience to carry on. And I don't think it's about being conscious of time. And he talks about goals in here, and I've always had a bit of a problem with goals, right? Because goals imply that there's a linear progression from where I am to where I want to be, and that this concept of a future better me exists. Really what we're talking about when we talk about creativity, there's no, to be really creative, to produce something special, you've got to be so immersed in it, in my opinion, that you forget about the time. And time is the start. He goes in Flow, in his other book, Flow, he talks about the distortion of time in the flow state. And in fact, Abraham Maslow also talks about it in Peak Experience from Toward a Psychology of Being. He talks about time and how to achieve that peak experience, you've got to be absent of time. And I think when you're in something so immersed in it, and you lose that whole, time shouldn't matter. You're in it, you're already doing it. And an aspect of the peak experience or the flow experience is that the activity, the thing you're engaged in, is the goal. You're already doing it. So I think if we can find a way to do work that truly turns us on and engages our curiosity, I think that's a key thing. And he talks about it here too, about curiosity and the importance of following our curiosity. If we can find that and allow ourselves to just be lost in it, we can create something special. I think the problems occur for us in creative work, whether it's business, whether it's art, whether it's writing, whatever it is. The problems occur when we start to count our chickens, and we say, well, I'm not there yet, and it creates anxiety and stress. And it's like, you see the result today and you go, well, that's not what I wanted, and you get uptight about it, and then you lose enthusiasm and you say, to hell with this. And I think it especially happens in business. You know, if you've got a creative outlet, let's say you're a writer or an artist or a plumber, and you love your work so much so that you want to do your own thing, you want to create your own thing, something that you can call your own, and set your own hours and go out and do work for people that, you know, you regard as good. Then the whole complexity and the need to make money and the need to have people and have staff and build this thing and let's go and take over the world and stuff, I think it destroys our creative energies to an extent. If we can't find a way to kind of move between the intensity of the work and then the organization that's needed, I haven't figured that out yet, but I haven't figured out how to do it. But I think it's a huge challenge for people in business, especially, or a creative person, a musician, or an artist to some degree, being able to turn that creative work into something, you know, that generates a living. I'm kind of gone off the topic a little bit, what I was talking about there, but endurance and perseverance is what he was talking about there. He goes on then, another trait, creative individuals, he says, alternate between imagination and fantasy at one end, and a rooted sense of reality in the other. And that's, you're really just talking about the same stuff, you know. You've got to be able to just become lost in your own imagination, I think, in order to create something special, something that people go, wow, look at that, you know. This guy is great. This guy or this girl knows what they're doing. Look at what they've produced. Hire him, hire her, you know. And they're prepared then to maybe pay you what you're asking. There's got to be an element of being lost in the work, like I said. But then, as Chisent Mihaly says, you've got to be able to come back into the real world as well and show it off. How are we on time? You just keep me on tabs there. Don't
keep going.
I just go on rambling here, you know.
You're fine.
I've got all kinds of, like, this whole book. I'll just show you here. The book, I've got these little markers and underlinings all over the place, and it kind of helps. I know you mark your books out as well, Rob, when you're reading, but you know, you have little thoughts that occur. Maybe you agree with what's been said in the book, or maybe you don't. I wrote a note at the front of it, and after reading the book, just for myself, and I said I have trouble reading my own handwriting at times, but I'll do my best here. It says, regard to creativity, right? We look for commonalities in people, activities, and events when trying to understand how favorable circumstances come about. We say, what is it? What is this here? So we might be able to replicate it or replicate them, but maybe it is in that perceived similarity. In other words, here's a trait of creativity. Let's repeat it. Or here's what's similar about all these people who have been, you know, massively creative in the world. This is what you need to be like if you want to be creative. I think that's a flawed idea. And I just went on to say here, but maybe it is in that perceived similarity that we get lost, and only in the differentiation that creativity and uniqueness can be expressed. I just think that's valid, you know.
I think it might be the one part that stood out for me as well is when you said about creating the environment for creativity rather than replicating the actual creative act, you know. And I think that's the part that's probably how to create that environment to allow somebody can. And I presume that environment could be different for everybody, you know. But figuring out that how they can get into that and then get out of it, because you could be creative forever and that might be satisfying your desires, but it mightn't pay the bills, or it mightn't, you know, have some sort of ability to monetize or to get something of value to others from it, you know. I
think that the pressure, you know, if you take like artists and musicians and creative people in that kind of traditional creative mode, I did a final year thesis on this topic actually this year, but like traditionally creative people would have enormous problems meeting the demands of business, like marketing and sales and all that kind of stuff, and it's exhausting for them. And I think there's a reason for that, It's because they're at their best when they're engaged in their creative work. And to be asked now to be analytical and to be organized in someone else's definition of being organized and follow all these rules that are so tight and produce the goods, let's be honest about it, if you're in the commercial world. But I think that they can't go there, a lot of them, because they're so open-minded and so playful and so engaged in that particular aspect of their work, that this way of behaving is alien almost, but there was something else I wanted to say there. Oh yeah, you were talking about the environment. So a few years ago, I was in class and a lecturer said, we were talking about something. It was a cognitive psychology class, and he was talking about, I don't know what he was talking about, but maybe machine learning or something like that. But he made a statement that actually stuck with me, and I was glad to hear it at the time. He said there are no facts, and what he meant by that was, you can take a photograph of the scene, and you can take a photograph of the landscape, or you can take a photograph in terms of data of all of these people at this particular point in time, and say, this is what I found. But it might have been true at that particular moment, or for that particular group of people over that period of time, but it's not fixed. It's like a photograph. And if you do the same test on the same people today or next week, you're going to get a different result, slightly different result. There might be, similarities, but invariably there's going to be differences. You talk about the majority of people falling under the bell curve, but you try, when you do a study, you try and find what's applicable to the population, to the general population. That's fine, but it doesn't tell you. You're not identifying the creative people. You're not identifying the creative work. You're just telling me what's a fact about most people most of the time over this particular period. It's the outliers that that produce the creative work that makes us go, whoa, look at that, and it's the outliers that actually disrupt, that cause major change in society. That's where the creative people live, So you've got to create an environment where, and Dean Keith Simonton talks about this as well, that it's the environment that allows the creativity, and boxing people in with strict roles and strict rules is not an environment for creativity to come about. You've got to have that freedom and ability to kind of pull different ideas together and produce something special. What else have I got here? Imagination and fantasy. Yeah, I was talking about that. So just to go on from that point, Csikszentmihalyi says on page 64, he says, I don't think there is a such thing as reality. There are wildly varying descriptions of reality, and you've got to be alert to when they change and what's really going on. No one is going to truly grasp it, but you have to stay true. You have to stay truly active on the end. That implies you have to have multifaceted perspective. There is a set of realities that exist at any moment in time. I always have some kind of a model in my mind. So when I think in my mind as to what I think is going to be on in the world, I'm always tuning to that model and trying to get different insights as I look at things. And I try to relate it back to what it means to our business and to how one behaves, if you will. So I think that's a quote from someone there. But so that's I have another point here. creative people seem to harbor opposite tendencies on the continuum between extroversion and introversion. We touched on that already. So you're really talking about the same thing. He goes on, mentions further points here. I mean, we could go on all night talking about this book. But I think if we're going to nurture creativity, we've got to be willing to step outside the box, so to speak, you know? You know, lose the title, lose the robes, loaf around a bit, be comfortable doing nothing. I've learned how to do that in the last few years, and it's a relief, to be honest with you, because for years I was so uptight about work. You know, it was like if I wasn't working 6 days a week, there was a problem, and if I didn't have loads of blokes and didn't have loads of vans, and I wasn't, you know, stirring it up and making a big, I felt that the big prize was out there in the world, or someone knew the answer out there, but really that's not what's going on at all. I think to be, you know, being busy was everything, and I think we've got to get away from that. I mean, most of we know better, but it's actually putting it into practice is the challenge, you know, because, you know, especially if you're in a role where there's people depending on you, and you have maybe, I hate using the word, but you've got subordinates that you need to direct and all that kind of stuff. Or you have people working for you who are waiting for you to arrive before they do anything. You know, it's difficult. It's really difficult. Which is why now, like, I just operate on my own. All I do is sit here at this desk and I write. Well, I do the day job and that pays the bills, but there's nothing I love more than just coming into this room, whacking on the keyboard and just pulling a book off the shelf. Any one of probably hundreds I have now, and just getting stuck into a subject and seeing what I can pull up, you know. That's the enjoyment for me. I don't want the whole concept of being successful, and I might be getting off the point, but it's all relevant. The whole concept of being successful has changed, you know. There's not an external ideal that I've latched onto. It's like, if I'm here, I'm happy as a pig in the proverbial, you know. That's all I want to do, and I think it's an important place. I think if we're going to be happy, because that's really what we're talking about, you know, we're going to be happy with our lives and be productive to a certain extent, and be able to look back on what we've done and say, yeah, that was good. Well, we've got to give ourselves a break, you know.
Definitely. I think it sounds like you found that. So, what was there any kind of not only turning point, but just kind of key moment from that made you kind of turn to appreciate what you have and roll back on that kind of busy attitude? Was there anything that came up?
I think another writer that, well, he's gone a while now, but if anyone wants to check it out, Richard Buckminster Fuller, you want to pick yourself a copy of Critical Path. Out there, it's there somewhere, but it's a fairly thick volume. It basically documents his life, but he spoke about or wrote about a turning point for him. And as I read the book, it's kind of, Jesus, that's nearly the same as me. That's the same. I live the same thing, I suppose. But it's like you chase these ideals of success. You know, these notions, whether it's a figure in the bank, whether it's the number of employees, whether it's how many followers you have, whether it's, you know, all this kind of rubbish. And you'll chase that for a while. But then there has to be a collapse. And I think on a human sense, across the globe, we can see it now. There's a bit of a collapse going on. And I think it's an important collapse, and it's going to be disturbance for a while. And society and culture is just turned upside down right now. But it has to happen, and it has to happen on an individual level as well as a global level, on a human race level, because otherwise, how do we know? How do we know we're heading in the wrong direction? So, from my own perspective, it was about that flux, that major shift, you know, where everything you've tried, everything everyone told you, everything, you know, you heard at conventions and seminars and business this and business that, it all failed to work and collapsed in a pile of shit, pardon my French. And you've no choice but to face the reality that all of this effort that you put in was wasted. So now, what are you going to do? You know, you have no choice. You have no choice but to kind of sit there and reflect for a while, you know. And it's kind of a quiet period where nothing happens. And then all of a sudden things start to change and new things start to come in, the dust settles kind of, and then you end up going in a new direction. And all of that experience has kind of helped you see a little bit clearer, you know, that it's not about the shillings, and it's not about, you know, the prize, and it's not about the suit, and it's not about any of that crack. It's almost like it's something that you can't even talk about, you know. You just know it when it hits, you know. So these days, I love to sit here and I love to write. I was drawing for a while, but it kind of stopped that because writing just takes over. So I'm enjoying my studies, really enjoying my studies, and I'm in a happy place. I'm not making a mint, you know. I'm doing all right. I'm making a few bob. I'm paying the bills, but it's not about that anymore. So I think for us to get to that really creative place where we're actually happy with our work, there has to be a turn, there has to be a collapse, and we've got to be willing to go there, you know. We've got to be willing to take a chance and realize that what we're doing may fail, but go anyway. And there's nothing lost in that, you know. There's nothing lost in, you know, losing the seat of your pants or your shirt, because it's all valuable, you know. And I think once you transition to it, I will say that's how it was for me. Once you pass through that kind of thing, you end up in a better place, you know.
Mm-hmm. Larry, can I ask a question? Does he mention education at all? Because it just seems to me like we have these children that are so naturally creative, and then they're pushed through this education system that's so rigid. Yeah. And then we enter the working world, and then we hit that point that you've just been talking about, where we want to be creative again. Do you know what I mean? I just wondered.
Yeah, the chapter titles here is "Where is Creativity?" The creative personality, the work of creativity. That might be relevant. The flow of creativity touches on flow, creative surroundings. The early years, he talks about these people who took part in the study are some of the most successful people in the world in science, in academia, in business, in art, and what have you. And he studies their early years. So he has something to say about that. It was 151. But I agree with you. There was a program on the telly the other night there on RTE, I think, and they were looking at this primary school, boarding school in Wicklow, I think, somewhere. It was the only primary boarding school in Ireland, and it was all so free and loose. And
was it the Sudbury School? No, wasn't that one?
I'm not sure, but it just it just struck me how different it was in their approach to school and children. I mean, I agree with you. So many notable people have remarked about how school kind of knocks creativity out of kids, because really what it wants, it's there to create pawns for the machine, so to speak. You know, people, workers for the society. And even now, like you see it in third level education, the colleges are funded by corporations. That's where they get their money from. So not in always, but I think in large respect, they influence the direction of the research. And people, you know, I won't say it's completely that way, but certainly.
It's a great TED Talk, Sir Ken Robinson. He just died.
Oh, yeah, he passed away. Yeah. I've seen some of the stuff here as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's exactly what he says too. Yeah.
So he talks about the early years. I'm sure there's something in there, all right. Childhood and youth. In our culture, perhaps in all cultures, some of the most cherished stories relate to childhood heroes, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, I'm sure there's something in there. Yeah.
Great.
It's actually those chapters 3, 4, and 5. I spent most of my time on those, because as soon as I kind of found myself in those chapters, so I kept reading them over and over and over again. And there's other aspects of the book that I kind of said, no, I don't agree with that. That's not no, you're not. You're way off the mark there. But then this section kind of appealed to me. So I'm suppose I'm being a little bit biased in terms of what I'm talking about. But I don't think what he says is any less relevant, you know, in terms of how creativity happens. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Great. Thanks.
Harry, love the review. Just a quick question from my side. Just, I suppose, I love the idea of balance, that it's light and shade, that you can step into creativity. Some people can step into it a bit more easier. But like in terms of balance, like you can see that structure and logic and strategy seems to be kind of the societal norm.
Yeah.
Like obviously, if we're to balance that up with creativity, you know, what would you suggest, or what does the book kind of promote in terms of actually just being able to tap into a bit more creativity in our lives to get that balance?
I think it's. I don't think I'm missing one of the main features of the book when I say that. He's talking about having the ability and the freedom to let loose and then come back into the work. But I think a big problem for us as human beings is that we're born into this. We're born into this rule of law, you know, almost that success equals, here's the path, you know, and you have to go down the path. And a lot of people fall off, you know, and they end up doing work that really they're not passionate about. They're doing it because it pays the bills. And part of the study that I did early this year, I asked the question, how do you feel about your work? There was 230 respondents to the survey. And I asked people, how do you feel about your work in emotional words? And 42% of respondents of the coded responses that I extracted from the participants' comments suggested that they had a negative relationship with their work. So you had comments such as, it's a means to an end, or I do it, it's okay, but and on the extreme end, there were people who just completely hated their work and couldn't, you know, had no way out. And then on the other extreme, you had people who were just in love with their work, you know, who one person said that, probably misquoting now, one person said that, I'm so happy to be able to help other people, or something to that effect. So I think the biggest problem is that we have this it's kind of like two parallel lines, and if you fall in within those parallel lines, you'll do all right. But for those people who don't, who fall outside, you have those who are extremely successful, they're extremely creative because they've made their own path, and then you have the other people who maybe can't make it work and just fall off the wayside. And I think that's a problem. I think our system is too rigid, you know. People haven't got, you know, you have to go to work. It's like 9 to 5, you know, Monday to Friday. For me, for a long time, it was like Friday was a relief, and Sunday night was like, oh, work, Larry is back, you know. My wife would say, stay away, work, Larry's here, you know, stay away. And it was like I used to dread Monday morning, even when I was working for myself. So I think the rigid systems that we put in place for work are problematic, because we're not like human beings are not machines, you know. We're not designed to be bureaucrats, you know, and to operate to a strict rule of law. I know we do a lot of the times, but I think history has shown us that explodes, that it can't work that way for us. We've got to have freedom of expression, you know, creative expression.
And just even to balance it up then, Larry, like, so if you're in that real rigid structure, paying the bills, you're within the tramlines as you talk about, like, just even suggestions, like, I mean, how can you balance up? How can you get a bit of space? And we talk about,
you know, get out and go for a run, go for a walk. You know, if structure is important and your job requires it, I mean, fine. But you've got to be able to get away from it. I mean, I'm not telling you anything that hasn't been said before, but you just got to make time for you doing stuff that's not, you know, like find a creative outlet, you know, do pottery, do the garden, do wood turning, do something that takes you away from the rigidity of the work that pays the bills. I think that's a problem with work, is that we have this transactional relationship with it. It's like, I'll give you hours if you give me money, and then I'll pay off all my bills with the money that you give me. And this is, roller coaster, or not roller coaster, but merry-go-round of doing work for the sake of shillings, but there's no real love in it. You know what I mean? You've got to have. There's got to be some meaning and purpose to work. It can't be just about earning $1 and paying bills. It just can't. You can't be creative in that kind of mode. You just burn yourself out. You hit 40 and you have an existential crisis, like me.
Brilliant, thanks.
Yeah.
I loved what you were saying, Larry, about playfulness, and I think we definitely lose that a lot as we get older. Did he have any ideas around, other than what you just, I guess, shared with Dec around getting outside, thinking differently, giving yourself space to be creative? Anything else he had around the playfulness piece?
See, in that particular chapter, he's just talking about what he saw in respondents to his multiple surveys that he did, but just want to see if I can find anything here.
When you're doing that,
while you're looking, I'll just share with the group. I've started reading the Culture Code, and it starts with the story about a study Peter Skillman did with Harvard, and it's called the Spaghetti Marshmallow Challenge. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. But there was 2 groups, business grad students and then kindergarten children, so about 5 to 6. And they basically had to make a tower with spaghetti and marshmallows. And it kind of resonates with what you've been talking about, Larry, because what they actually found was it was the children who were able to actually make a tower that was 26 inches high, because they just got in there and did it. They started playing around with the marshmallows and the spaghetti, and they thought of things from a convergent perspective. Is that right? Or is it divergent?
The divergent side said, at least in the book, he says the divergent, go out and pick material from various different areas of your experience and just put them together in unique ways,
Yeah, exactly. And whereas the business grad students stood around talking about what to do and spent ages trying to figure out who should be the leader and who should do what, and they didn't just get in there and do it. And that's exactly what you're saying. Yeah,
there's I've written about this before, although not as much as I'd like. But this is a book by Stuart Brown. It's called Play. And in that book, he talks about how it shapes the brain, opens the imagination, invigorates the soul, and how he talks in this book about how important play is to the development, or development, or cognitive development, or development in society and what have you. So it's an interesting read, and there's a TED Talk by him as well, which is good. You should check that out.
Cool. Thank you.
Cool. That's all I've got for you anyway, unless you want to dig a bit further, Rob and Declan.
No, I think we normally kind of wrap it around about the 50-minute or so mark anyway, and I think that was great, Larry, because I really liked your just open and honest inputs on it, and there's no right or wrong way to do this, and it's always good to do it a little bit differently as well. So I think it was well received, and I'm delighted that you were willing to come along and do it. So thanks for doing that.
I appreciate the invite. Good to talk to you again, actually. It's probably over a year since we had a conversation.
Oh, definitely. I think it was early last year, probably, when we talked the last time. So, it's good to have you along. More than welcome to come along again to these every couple of weeks. I think, as Sarah said there, she's up next talking about the culture code. So that should be an interesting one.
Definitely. Well, thanks very much for your time and tonight, and for the invite. I enjoyed it.
Magic. Thanks a million, Larry. It was magic.
Great
Thanks,
stuff.
Larry.
Thanks a lot,
I'm going
Larry.
to read that book, Play.
Yeah.
Thanks a million. Really good.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Larry. Very good.
No bother at all. Delighted to be here.
Thanks a lot. Have a good evening, guys. We'll see you in
Bye,
a couple of
guys.
weeks.
Thanks, Rob.
Good luck.
Bye.
Bye,
Good night.
everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you again. Bye.